there's a couple interesting patterns to look at here when I'm looking at my numbers and subtracting. Okay, sometimes it's not as easy with addition, right? Sometimes when you subtract a positive from a positive, you get a positive. Sometimes you get a negative, though. Right? Same thing with subtracting negatives from negatives. Sometimes you get a negative, sometimes you get a positive. It's not really an easy rule to tell whether you get a negative or a positive when you're subtracting. But here's one thing that we can do. Okay? Let me teach you another way of dealing with this. So we just learned about adding, subtracting, or sorry, we just learned about subtracting integers with integer tiles by inviting over zero sum pairs. And I think that worked pretty well. But let me show you one other way of thinking about these. And I'll go ahead and use the same examples, actually. I don't have to write any more examples. So let's do the 7 problems here again, but showing it in a different way. So I'm going to start off with 3, and I'm going to subtract 2. All right. Now you can think of it as a taking away, but here's another way of thinking about subtraction. Subtraction is the same thing as adding the opposite of a number. Okay. So let's think of it this way. Instead of subtracting 2, I can add the opposite of 2. I can add negative 2. Okay. So I'm going to write that right here next to it. Actually, I'm going to write it right here. This is the same thing. Put a little line. This is the same thing as adding the opposite. So before we started with 3 and we subtracted positive 2, but I can also think of it as adding negative 2. Okay? So the first number is the same. My sign is changing. Instead of subtracting, I'm going to add. And now my second number changes from a positive to a negative. And when I do that, now I'm adding chips. I'm not subtracting anything away. Until, oh yeah, like making marriages again. Hey, this feels better. Hey, I feel good. Video 2, we're making some marriages again. These guys get married, this guy's getting married, and we end up with 1. Right? So if you really don't like subtracting because you feel like you're divorcing people, that's okay. There's a way of doing it. Replacing all the subtraction signs with adding signs. You just got to flip that second number, make from a positive to a negative, negative to positive. So let's try the next one. 2 minus 4. Well, that's the same thing as 2 plus, not 4, but negative 4. Right? The opposite of 4. And if I did that with my chips, I'd start off with 2, and I'd add negative 4 to it. Right? And now I'm making marriages. I feel great. These guys get married. These guys get married into a zero-sum pair, and I have 2 negatives left over at the end. Sure enough, that was exactly the same thing we got when we were doing the divorce method, right? Okay, let's try another one. Starting off with negative 3. Before I was subtracting 3. This time I'm going to add negative 3. Let's see what we get. And I should get negative 6, right? Now we don't have to go back and forth in these colors so much. Oops. I'm going to add negative 3. So if I add 3 negatives and 3 negatives, I end up with 6 negatives. Yeah, that wasn't too bad. All right. How about the fourth one? So we had negative 2. Before we were subtracting positive 1. But now we're going to add negative 1 to see what we get. We're going to add negative 1. Okay, so we start off with negative 2, add negative 1, and we end up with negative 3s. Okay. All right. The next one up, we had negative 3 minus negative 1. So I'm gonna start off with the same thing, negative 3, but I'm not going to subtract. I'm going to add the opposite of negative 1, which is positive 1. Okay. So I'm going to do negative 3 plus 1. Okay, so negative 3, add 1. I have 1 zero-sum pair. They go off to Las Vegas, and I'm left with negative 2. Negative 2. See how this works? All right, 2 more. Let's try them out. Negative 2. Start off with negative 2. But in this case, instead of subtracting negative 4, I'm going to add positive 4. I'm going to add the opposite of what I used to be subtracting. Okay, so if I have negative 2, and I add 4 more to there, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I take away my zero-sum pairs. Congratulations, guys. I'll get you your wedding present as soon as you tell me where you're enrolled. And I end up with 2, just like before. And the last one, we're going to start off with 3, but instead of subtracting -4, I'm going to add +4. I'm going to add +4. And sure enough, you can easily see that we're going to end up with 7. Okay? So exactly the same answer, right? That should be. So we can think of it as when you're subtracting integers, you can either add some zero-sum pairs until you have enough to actually take away, or you can think of it as adding the opposite, turn into an addition problem by creating the opposite of that second number. However you want to think of it. Generally, the one that really confuses people the most is when we subtract negatives. People just, subtracting negatives really confuses them. And so I always tell my students, hey, if you have a problem like 3 minus -5, I say literally take your pencil and just write over that and change it to a plus sign. Bam, 3 plus 5. Now it's easy, right? So subtracting a negative is the same thing as adding a positive, because subtracting is just the same thing as adding the opposite of. Right? So that was that video, and I'm going to go off.